Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy. In our fifth series, we're focusing on 100 years of American democracy. And one subject that we haven't looked at, it's implicit in everything we think about, is the role, the place of immigration to America in the American democracy of the last 100 years. And one man who's given a great deal of thought intellectually and on the ground to this is my guest. He's an iconic journalist in his own right, Ray Suarez. You all know the voice and the name. And he has a new book out, We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century, an oral history. Ray Suarez, welcome to How to Fix Democracy.
Great to be with you, Andrew.
Ray, before we start, tell us a little bit about your background as an American.
Well, I'm a Puerto Rican guy from Brooklyn, and they're often called New Yorkers because in the decades after the Second World War, a very large Puerto Rican community grew in New York from people who were fleeing the terrible poverty of the island. What a lot of people don't remember is that that was really a planned migration. The big boys with the big brains who were thinking about what Puerto Rico might become to the United States actually came up with a plan that envisioned 750,000 people leaving the island and heading to the mainland to work. And my family was part of that big exodus, that big migration. There are some authors and analysts who've said if only they hadn't gone to New York, which at that moment was about to begin a multi-decade slide as it deindustrialized.
What year, Ray?
We're talking about 1950 and after. So the funny thing about Puerto Ricans is that they are American citizens from the day they draw their first breath due to an act of Congress in 1917. So you're sort of insiders and outsiders at the same time, perceived as foreign, often having an accent, congregating in neighborhoods that reproduce some of the cultural norms of Puerto Rico, so seen as not quite us, but still as American as anybody, which gives you that funny liminal status. Insiders, outsiders, able to sort of play both sides of the street.
Well, that liminality is, I think, the thing that defines your career as a writer and thinker. You probably heard the term American dream so many times that it's become a little bit of a nightmare for you. But when you were growing up, did your parents talk about something called the American dream?
Sometimes in so many words, often not, but it was implicit that I would do better than they did, that I would get a better education, have more years of schooling, and make a go of it in America that they felt constrained from doing. They were very successful on their own terms. My mother worked for the city of New York. My father was a small businessman eventually. And they felt they were very lucky that they had done well by America and America had done well by them, but certainly always in front of them, like a pole star, was the idea that their kids would do better than they did.
And going back to that liminality of being both simultaneously insider and outsider, when you were growing up, was it assumed that you could be both Puerto Rican, Hispanic, if that's the right word, and American, or did you have to choose between those?
It's always been in process. It's always been a status that's in formation. Just how in and just how out you were at any moment was a product of the times you were living in, how many impediments you felt there were to your moving ahead and moving forward, and how others perceived you. I sometimes joke that when I moved overseas to work as a reporter, I lived in Italy for a time, I lived in the United Kingdom for a time, I never felt more American than when I lived in those places where people didn't know about the niggly little details of what a Puerto Rican was or wasn't, and just took me as American, which many of my fellow Americans won't or don't.
What about American democracy, Ray? You spent your career thinking about it, critiquing it, celebrating it. How does the history, in broad terms, I want to get into some details later in our conversation, but how does the broad history of American immigration over the last 100 years tie into the history of American democracy?
Beautifully, as it happens, because when you look at the decades after the Second World War, we were in many ways an imperfect democracy. Over time, since 1789 and the drafting of the Constitution, opening the door further and further, opening the definitions further and further to humanity, to common humanity, what it means to be us, the franchise of women, the franchise eventually over time of Black Americans who had been property in much of the United States. So I say a democracy, an operating democracy, but an imperfect one for most of our history. And the newest generations of immigrants come to the United States in the post-war decades with aspiration, with an ideal America living in their heads that they have yet to live their way into. But they really, they are part of the process of the country really being forced to think about what it means to come in as an outsider and become one of us. And that drags democracy ever closer to that great ideal of all men being equal and all men having a place, all humans having a place in the civic whole.
Ray, one of our earlier guests in How to Fix Democracy is the constitutional scholar, I'm sure you know his work, Jeffrey Rosen. His last book is on the importance of the Constitution, a return to it in terms of making sense of what it means to be American, what it means to have an American democracy in the context of happiness. He's a scholar, almost a Talmudic scholar of the Constitution.
And a lovely man, along with being brilliant. So.
And like you, I think he's a precious jewel of America. But I wonder, were the founders, did they have any idea in terms of when they were putting this thing together that America was going to become an immigrant country?
I think they had some sense. There were already French Huguenots, Dutch and Swedes. There were people here from other places who were becoming part of the civic whole in Delaware, in Pennsylvania, in the Hudson River Valley. Did they have an idea of this amazing, multi-hued, polyglot, multi-religious democracy? Probably not. There was no country on earth like this one that you could think of as an active model. So if you suggested to some of the more far-seeing of them, maybe they would have rolled it around in their head and said, I can see that happening. But the idea that there would be millions of Muslims here, millions of Hindus, Buddhists, that the main driver in American demographics would be people with no religious affiliation at all, that millions of people would be of mixed parentage and mixed race and report such on the census, I think that was, even though they were pretty smart guys, that was probably beyond their imaginings.
Ray, how do we generalize about the waves of immigration in the 19th century? My understanding, and I don't know this stuff that well, is that the history of industrialization and the history of immigration really go hand in hand. Before industrialization, America was just another agrarian country. And as it industrialized, everything changed, and a lot of that had to do with immigration.
Sure. We transitioned over the course of decades from being Thomas Jefferson's country to being Alexander Hamilton's. And that's a really key insight. Of course, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are things happening in Europe that act as both push and pull. The lack of success for the United Ireland movement, which sees people in the very first years of the 19th century leaving Ireland and coming to the United States. The revolutions of 1848, eruptions all across Central Europe that come along with industrialization and a restlessness about democracy and wanting to have more civic power in the running of the affairs of state, and millions of people becoming landless proletarians, people with very little claim to the goods of the place they were living. You could get on a boat in Norway or Sweden, sail to the United States, and through the good offices of the United States, be given a farm. Be given a farm. And you'd get on the brand new railroads, relatively new railroads, head out west to your land as long as you promised to work it. It was an amazing time. Even as we were debating the humanity of black people, we were giving land away that we were taking from somebody else, but giving land away to people who were coming from another part of the world who said, in effect, yeah, I'll put in the sweat equity and we will make you landowners. It's a remarkable thing. And it helped contribute to the growing of the country. The people who were wargaming this out in the second half of the 19th century were pretty smart. And they realized the inducements would create a certain kind of country. And they were right. So while the smokestacks are rising in Pittsburgh, the sodbusters are putting farms out on the frontier. It created an amazing, dynamic country, held together eventually by railroads, able to get commodities from here to there to be processed and sold and shipped. It was the second half of the 19th century in the United States is one of the most amazing periods in world history, much less American history.
As Ray, as you said, as America shifted from a Jeffersonian to a Hamiltonian democracy, from a small farmer democracy to a big government, or certainly a bigger government democracy, we had the rise of something called American conservatism. We've done shows on that, lots of shows actually, on the American conservative tradition. For some people, the idea of American conservatism is a contradiction in terms. Do you think there's some truth to that, given that American democracy has always defined itself as an immigrant society? It's possible to be a conservative and maintain the principles, the spirit of an immigrant democracy?
Well, there's not really one conservatism. There's conservatisms. And the one that sought to define itself as the lead, let's say, the straw that stirs the drink, the tone setter, thermostat setter for American life. That's the one that really has had a lot of appeal, but it's the one that really misunderstands the country most of all. This idea that Americans of a certain background, of a certain particular history, are the ones who get to be the lead brother, who tell everybody else how it's going to go. That's been a repeated error in our cultural history and our political history, and it's one that's being made today.
Ray, let's fast forward from the 19th century to the beginnings of the 20th century, when our series begins 1924. In that year, was America an immigrant society? What happened after the First World War? We've done shows on the appearance of the FBI and a stronger government, a more intrusive government. Was America in 1924 an open society when it came to immigration?
It was a society that was regretting being as open as it was, at least for the people in charge. There was a backlash against basically 50 years of very, very heavy immigration to the United States. A surge tide from Europe of tens of millions of people that had remade the cities of the Great Lakes, the Northeast, that had remade our industrial life, that had remade our cultural life. And while it was a yeasty, exciting place to be, you had George M. Cohan, and you had Irving Berlin, you had all these new cultural giants being made.
Although interesting about all those guys, they all changed their name.
Yes, yeah.
To be...
Asa Berlin became Irving Berlin, and Asa Yolson became Al Jolson, and Israel Berlin became Irving Berlin. Yeah, they changed their name. That was part of the immigrant thing in those days, part of the ethic, wanting to fit in. But McNamara's ragtime band and things that we consider Tin Pan Alley, brill building, American cultural production that comes surging out of New York and heads to the rest of the country on these new 78 records. That's an immigrant-fueled industry. And immigrants were dominating baseball, which at the time was the only real national sport and remained America's pastime for decades after that. There was this really wonderful, interesting surge of the first generation of Americans to be born on U.S. soil, heading out into the country and helping define what the times were. But there was a backlash against it. Foreign ideas, foreign religions, foreign political philosophies. There were worries about anarchism, socialism, communism, the arrests of Sacco and Vanzetti, the moves, very aggressive moves against the labor movement.
Emma Goldman getting sent back to Eastern Europe.
Yeah, a lot of deportations, especially using First World War legal powers and defining sedition and defining working against the war effort as a pretext for being sent home. Yeah, a lot of leftists were kicked out of the country when they complained about fighting the Millionaires' War.
Yeah, we did a show at the beginning of the series with Adam Hochschild, wonderful historian, has written an extremely good book about this. What about the African American?
But 1924, very critical year in the life of American immigration, because the Immigration Act of 1924 is written that basically says, we've had enough of that. We've done this grand social experiment for decades now. We're slamming the door. We're making it harder to come in. We're making a new set of formulas and quotas that favor Western Europeans for immigration to the United States. And those men, because they were indeed all men, sitting in smoke-filled rooms in Washington, D.C., couldn't have imagined 1929. They couldn't have imagined the Great Depression or the Second World War, but they put a matrix in place that would really dictate the terms of American migration for decades to come, without realizing that with the added layering of global depression and world war, not a lot of people would be coming to the United States for the next 40 years.
You talk about they, Ray. Was it mostly the white male Republican presidents of the 20s? We did a show with Amity Shlaes on Calvin Coolidge, of course, who may have been president. He was opposed to the idea, it seems, of politics and power and government. He just wanted, he was a pure Jeffersonian in a very nostalgic sense. Was the legislation of restricting immigration, of making America a white, quote unquote, democracy? Can we, again, I use this word carefully, blame Republicans for this, or were the Democrats involved as well?
Oh, it was definitely a bipartisan effort. The Ku Klux Klan had a resurgence in the 1920s as well, far outside the bounds of the historic South of the Confederacy. And that was fueled by Democratic voters and Democratic middle-class residents across the country. There was a sense that we were losing the America of our forefathers with all these Jews and socialists and Roman Catholics, and really we ought to get back to real Americanism. And that was not by any means a Republican project. It was a sort of national ethno project, you might say.
Sounds ominous, Ray. A national ethno project. They had those in Europe as well in the 30s.
Yeah, and look at what a great success they were.
What about the role of African Americans in all this? Were they the perpetual insider-outsider, even though they'd been in the country longer than most of the whites, not because they chose to be here? Have Black Americans always been endless immigrants?
To the great detriment of the United States, an essential injustice that is only healing over a very long course of time. You find that in many ways, because of the enduring suspicion of Black Americans held by many whites, that you can never be American enough for them. In the 250 years of our history as a polity, the United States has had a hard time realizing what a break it caught, that Black Americans are as patriotic, as wed to the country, as willing to fight and die for it as they've been historically, always willing to again, yet again, audition for full American personhood. The fact that they did not en masse bail out and become really a rebel fifth column inside the country is something that we can only thank our lucky stars for. We can't say, well, it was because we're so cool and they want to be like us. We just were lucky that in the face of just nearly endless mistreatment, exclusion, marginalization, that Black Americans have stayed as true to the American creed as they have over the long haul.
And of course, one of the great crimes in the 20th century was taking their vote away in this quote-unquote democracy.
Using the sleight of hand of the pen and various apportionment formulas and tricks, basically, to water down, dilute, or negate their political power inside the country.
In terms of this period, Ray, what were the relations between the different immigrant communities? Was there racism and competition between them, or was the assumption is that the last in were not particularly liked by the second last in? Is there a history of racism and discrimination amongst American immigrants in the early part of the 20th century?
Well, the old saying among Black Americans was that the first word an immigrant learns in English is the N-word, because they get to slot in above Black people in the social hierarchy, much to the shame of the United States. But that's been true ever since immigration became a mass experience. Was that your experience
as an immigrant in the 50s?
I think there's, because Puerto Ricans are a heavily mixed race people, we have a slightly different experience from Irish and Italians and Poles and other earlier Roman Catholic immigrant groups. So it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but certainly the control of space, access to housing in neighborhoods, those kinds of questions are very much pigment controlled. And if you were very light-skinned and of Spanish ancestry, you probably had an easier time renting an apartment in Brooklyn or the Bronx or Upper Manhattan than you did if you were dark-skinned, a descendant of 19th century enslaved people in Puerto Rico or Cuba or the Dominican Republic.
Ray, I want to get to the Second World War period, but before we get there, how did the Great Depression change all this? Coolidge's utopia of Jeffersonian farmer democracy, of course, was proved to be a farce, even before the crash, but after the crash it became more self-evidently absurd. What was the history of immigration and the history of immigrants in the 30s during the Great Depression and the emergence of the New Deal?
Well, immigration slowed to a trickle, as it would when the calamity of economic meltdown visits itself not only on the United States, but throughout the world. Banks fail, the entire economic model on which the sort of machinery of day-to-day life was built was failing, seizing up, showing itself to be unworkable. If you had land as collateral, you found out your land was useless and the bank had no money anyway. It was just a crazy, crazy time. And during that calamity, there was very little migration to the United States. And because there was fear of what more new people would bring to an already stressed out economy, there was a reluctance to let people in when they did show up at the front door, like Jewish immigrants fleeing the expanding Nuremberg laws in Adolf Hitler's Germany. We weren't so sure we wanted to let them in either at a time. So very few new people came. The old people that were already here were getting older. And throughout that period, between 1924 and 1965, the average immigrant in the United States was transitioning from being younger than the median age American to being quite a bit older than the median age American, because few new immigrants were arriving.
Ray, recently I was in New Orleans at the World War II museum. I'm sure you've been there. And World War II, in that museum's terms, is presented as this moment where, leaving aside the Japan question, Americans or American democracy became more closely realized through the involvement of women and more people of different skin colors and religions and ethnicities in the army. Is that a narrative that you would share in your analysis of American democracy during the Second World War and the immigrant question and community?
Well, I'm always, as a reporter, trying to do quick comparisons of the real and the ideal. And the Second World War was one of those moments where we really aspirationally, as a people, or many did, tried to bring the real and the ideal closer together. If you look at the propaganda films of Frank Capra and John Ford, commissioned by the United States government, they were overtly propaganda films. Why We Fight, The Negro Soldier, The Negro Sailor. They were meant to be shown around the country to reinforce that idea of one nation with one national purpose and idealize the American experience in a way that made Americans realize what was different about this country when you compared it to Nazi Germany, Stalinist Soviet Union, and so on. It was a remarkable outpouring of our better selves, you might say, for a purpose. We had an existential threat. We wanted to survive as a country and bring our allies along with us. Absolutely. I don't want to be naive about this, but I think we had a sort of, oh yeah, oh that's right moment where this is what we're about. When you watch The Negro Soldier, it is a stunning, beautiful, moving, idealistic, and largely untrue depiction of the lives of black citizens in the United States, but still essential. And I think it's that tension between its idealism, its unreality, and its essentiality where the answer to your question lives, sort of in that lovely, tense place between those three values.
The war ended, great joy and victory and self-congratulation. The period after Ray has been presented by many conservatives and indeed liberals as a halcyon one of prosperity, America being the dominant world power. Of course, it was the period of the Cold War and the period of the so-called Eisenhower consensus for much of the 1950s. How does that fit in with the narrative of immigration? I know some people think that perhaps the Eisenhower years appear more attractive now because it was convenient because of the absence of mass immigration in this period.
Well, it's an undertold story what effect that immediate Cold War, that early Cold War period had on the way we thought about immigration. We were at that same moment saying to the rest of the world, our values are really the better values. Our system is really the better system. Look at who we are. We have Joe Louis, heavyweight champion of the world, and Ralph Bunche, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. And we have Jackie Robinson, heroic breaker of the color barrier in our national sport. And we have Dorothy Dandridge and Lena Horne. We are really the place that is open to people from everywhere. And yet, if you were going to the pictures in Senegal or Ghana or Nigeria, you might also see newsreels with hoses being opened, fire hoses being opened on young students, people at lunch counters in the South having food poured on them by people who don't want them to be able to eat at that counter. Politicians in the United States understood that part of our ideological war against the East, for want of a better term, could not credibly survive in the face of Jim Crow. We couldn't say to the world, hey, take a look at our system. And it's right there in the papers of Lyndon Johnson, in the papers of Emanuel Seller and many other politicians of the time. They understood that in the Cold War, part of our weaponry was who we were to the rest of the world. And that was one of the big motivating forces in getting the rewrite of American immigration laws done by the mid-60s.
But it's an odd phenomenon that I think most people aren't aware of, that as America celebrated its openness, its victory, its values, it shut the door on immigration between, 45 and mid-60s.
People came from displaced persons camps. I grew up in a neighborhood with a lot of Holocaust survivors, but they were not so numerous in the rest of the country. So the numbers were relatively small in a national context. So there were still people using the formulas of the mid-20s to come from Italy, to come from the British Isles, to come from Germany. There were some, but not the kind of numbers, because frankly, those countries were rebuilding and having a great old time. Les 30 Glorieuses, the 30 fabulous years after the Second World War in France. Il Miracolo in Italy, that gave birth to a new industrial base and a new flowering of culture. Those were great years in Europe, and if you're a country with a formula that governs immigration that's biased toward Europe, guess what? The national quotas go unused year after year after year.
They were less good years, though, in Latin and Central America and in Mexico. George Bush, I think, was the guy who described and first came up with the word southern border. Maybe I'm right, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. Was there much illegal immigration in the period after the Second World War from Central Latin America over that border?
There was some, a lot of it from Mexico. There was an economic relationship between Mexico and the southwestern United States that went on and flourished and developed regardless of this imaginary line, this border that was drawn from Corpus Christi, Texas to San Diego, California. The two parts of what were now two different countries always were sending people back and forth over that border, contingent labor, workers who planned on sojourning in the United States for 6 months or a year or 2 years and then going home. Mixed families of mixed origin, half the family coming from Tucson or San Diego or Los Angeles and half the family coming from Durango and parts south. Yes, there was some illegal immigration. There were periodic efforts to round up large numbers of Latin Americans and just ship them home. One infelicitously called Operation Wetback, spearheaded by the federal government with the help of the FBI and the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And they just went into barrios across the Southwest and rounded up tens of thousands of people, put them on buses and trains and sent them home, including large numbers of American citizens who were Spanish-speaking, who had no documents, but were born in the U.S. and ended up back in an ancestral hometown in Mexico.
But it never became a political issue for the reactionary right, from George Wallace to McCarthy, that it's become in the 2020s. Why
well, because
not?
the numbers and the proportions were just different. In the 1960 census, the U.S. Census counted 5% of the population of the country was born overseas. In this last census in 2020, it was closer to 14% of a much bigger country. So the numbers were just very, very different. And they were Nonna and Bubby and Zadie. They were old people mostly in 1960. They weren't They weren't people who were competing with you for jobs.
So what happened in the 60s? Was it another of Johnson's idealistic reforms to open the country up?
Well, there was real labor hunger. There was real hunger, even in the aftermath of the post-war baby boom. The United States had a rapidly growing economy, had a rapidly growing college and university system that was largely being taken up by the sons and daughters of the middle class, but also had plenty of room for Indian engineers and aspiring Lebanese and Syrian physicians, and on and on and on. And it just got a lot easier to be one of those people in the 1960s. So you get a vanguard population of the rest of the world finally coming in. Also, the Chinese Exclusion Act, to our shame, the only law written in the history of the Congress meant to bar people from one single country, sunsetted. And once it was no longer part of our legal framework, people from East Asia found it a lot easier to come to the United States as well. So Chinatowns, which had been vestigial little ethnic and vice consumption zones in San Francisco and New York and Boston and other places, now were growing, had women. They used to have an 80-20 male to woman ratio, but now there were growing places where you could be born and grow up. The Chinese Exclusion Act stunted the profile of the immigrant from the rest of the world for a long time. People had wanted to come, people could have been useful to our economy, but racism kept them out.
What are the numbers, Ray? You've got this new book, We Are Home. You've done this oral history of immigration. But what are the numbers between, say, 65 and 2024 in terms of immigration, and particularly compared to the previous period?
If you look at the birth countries of the last census before the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, 9 of the 10 birth countries of foreign-born Americans send immigrants to the United States that are, in their physiognomy, perceived as white. I'll leave aside the slippery, constantly changing definition of what a white person is. They look white, we think they're white, their kids are white, 9 out of 10. By 2020, 9 of the 10 countries are sending non-white immigrants to the United States. And it is the story in that one stat of the transition to America 2.0 that arrives sometime in the 2040s, when a tiny sliver majority of Americans will trace their ancestry to Africa, Asia, or Latin America rather than to Europe. European-descended Americans will still be the largest single portion of the population for the rest of the century. They will be the largest group in society, but not in such an overwhelming way that it isn't already creating something of an identity crisis for Americans now.
The subtitle of your book is Becoming American in the 21st Century, although the immigrants of the late 60s and 70s became American in whatever that means in the 20th century. Has the idea of becoming American changed in the post-65 America?
Well, technically, no. If you came in from anywhere in the world, if you look at the words of the pledge that every new citizen takes, nothing really down at the technical level has changed about coming an American. But that's, I guess, the difference between hardware and software. Then you head out into the society and people either perceive you as being such or they don't. And some new arrivals from different countries than were part of America's immigrant stock earlier find that they live in a kind of perpetual foreignness, that people don't take them as an American right away, or at first blush, or if they see them on the street, or if they talk to them for a bit. Asians sometimes laugh about it and call it the "where are you really from" question, where you'll see someone whose facial features speak strongly of South Asia, and you'll say, well, hey, where are you from? And they'll say, oh, I'm from Nutley, New Jersey, or I'm from Queens. And the person is then stuck in this spot because they really want to know whether you're Indian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi. but they don't know how to ask it in a polite way. So they'll often say, where are you really from? And what they really want to know is where your parents and your grandparents are from. And I think eventually the where are you really from question will just erode away under the force of numbers. We've got several members of Congress now who are both born in South Asia and of South Asian ancestry. They're kind of a mix. East Asians as well, Koreans, Vietnamese. Profiled in the book is the first Indian American to be elected to the New York City Council. Cool guy, interesting guy. I said to him, hey, you know, you've achieved all this success and notoriety. Are your parents sort of embarrassed that you're not a doctor? And he got what I was getting at, and he laughed. He said, yeah, but you know, also there's an immigrant suspicion of politics, and they're really a little afraid for me because they don't want me to get hurt in this world. New people always think, what you want is something really solid, like a DDS degree, and be a dentist. That's safe, it's respectable. Politician, I'm not so sure.
Has one of the consequences, some people might even say casualties, of the post-65 situation been the end of the promise of America as a melting pot, as a place where you lose your cultural identity?
The melting pot as a concept has had to be renegotiated. A lot of immigrants and immigrant-descended people themselves don't really like it anymore because the old idea of the melting pot was that you would become indistinguishable from the whole. And what they're trying to do now is, I think, a more suited to the 21st century kind of assimilation and acculturation, where you get the dance steps and you get the rhythm day in and day out of being American, and you do the things you need to succeed and get ahead, but you don't stop being entirely who you were and who you are. There is an attempt among a lot of groups to have younger generations continue to speak the home language. We'll see if that's a fool's errand. With every big immigration to the United States, there's been a falling away of the home language, the home country language, in every case. The great-grandson of Polish immigrants doesn't speak Polish. They may know a couple of dirty words in the names of food. The great-grandson of Italian immigrants knows a couple of words because they vaguely remember ancient relatives sitting in their apartments on Easter and Christmas, and they picked up a little here and a little there, but they don't speak Italian in the main. And I think that may happen as well, though it horrifies them to think it, with Koreans and various Indian subcontinent immigrants and so on. There is a new way of being who you are and who you were that I think will challenge the melting pot over time.
The great political phenomenon of the 21st century, Ray, again, don't need me to tell you this, two things. Firstly, increasing pessimism about democracy and the rise of right-wing, to some extent left-wing, but mostly right-wing populism. They're both intimately bound up with this history of immigration in post-65 America, aren't they?
Absolutely. Recently I was in the Ozarks, in southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. And I'm part of something called the American Communities Project that looks at American counties from coast to coast and does deep dive profiling of social attitudes in these places. And in this cluster of counties in southern Missouri that includes the entertainment hub of Branson, Missouri, and Springfield, Missouri, the home of Missouri State University, we asked people if they agree with the statement, "Sometimes I feel like a stranger in my own country." And in counties like these, there's a high degree of agreement with that statement, even though immigrants don't move to those places. There is a perception that's delivered by the internet, by mass media, by mass culture, that this is not the place where you dictate the tempo of cultural life anymore. And it alienates those people. to greater and lesser degrees. Some of them say, well, that's just life. Some of them really feel like they are now living in sort of hostile territory. They find American cities to be inexplicable and unintelligible. They find that they're more inclined to make hostile demands that people speak English, for instance, even though in the places they live, very few people speak anything else. So it's a kind of low-level backlash that builds on itself over time. It is not clear where this all leads. I mean, either they'll say, oh, well, this is America in the 21st century, or that kind of passion that we saw in Charlottesville, with huge numbers of men holding torches, yelling, "You will not replace us," really very consciously aware that they are not seen as the center lodgepole of America's future selfhood, that they will not be those who are gatekeepers, those who call the tune.
What's the best case scenario for America's future, what you call America's future selfhood in this increasingly diverse, multi-ethnic America of the 2020s and onwards? How can this new mix of Americans strengthen a democracy which many people see is in existential crisis?
I think on two fronts. One sort of overt and in your face, which is the economic front, as immigrants become a more and more necessary part of our economic life in a country where women's average fertility has declined well below replacement level and has been below replacement level for a long time now. Immigrants are an essential part of getting the work of society done every day, day in and day out, both from the chairman of Apple down to a cabbage field in the Imperial Valley in Southern California. The other sense is a more stealth sense. The Latin Grammys, the Latin American Music Awards will be on national television this year. There'll be bilingual programs with both commercials and presenters doing their work in English and Spanish. When you see the tremendous worldwide pickup of a single like Despacito. I was sitting in a cafe in southern France, and Despacito was playing over the loudspeaker, and I thought, yeah, this kind of song, written by a Puerto Rican, sung with a Canadian-American Justin Bieber. This is a product of America's amazing taking on all comers culture. But hip-hop, going to every corner of the globe. Music videos, now looking from everywhere the way they do on American television. The single largest cultural icons, the Marvel comic universe, all peopled by Americans and fueled by the American creative imagination. That country is being built quietly. I wasn't talking to people in the Ozarks about Despacito, but you can be sure they've heard it before. There is a stealth way that our new cultural icons, whether it's Mindy Kaling, whether it's Black Americans who have mixed ancestry, which is very true in Britain as well, people whose forebears came from the Caribbean and West Africa are now becoming big parts of our culture. That's happening without comment and without people even realizing that it's happening. So it's a two-prong attack on the citadels of the gatekeepers.
Finally, Ray, in a couple of years, America will be celebrating its 250th year anniversary. Two final questions for you. Will you be celebrating? And secondly, have you yourself become an American?
I'm an American with some qualifiers, and I'm perfectly comfortable with that. I'm very patriotic. I see America for what it is, what it has been, and what it can be. And that leaves me both shaking my head in regret, but also tremendously proud of what this country has accomplished in 250 years. I am a patriot. I'm even an Eagle Scout. I'm unabashedly and sentimentally American, while still being very eyes open about the rough road this country walked to become its better self. And I think if you can keep those two things in a kind of equilibrium, you can be a functioning American in the 21st century without driving yourself crazy.
Well, I can't speak on behalf of Americans. I'm not even American myself, Ray, although I will.
I couldn't tell.
I think you may not be altogether proud of being American, but I think Americans are proud of Ray Suarez. I want to thank you so much for appearing on How to Fix Democracy. Thank you so much, Ray Suarez.
Great to be with you. Thanks for the questions.